Hello, friends. Welcome to our July webinar for Authentic Intimacy. We are so glad that you are here. Per usual, it's me, Hannah, and Julie hanging out and spending some time with you, so we're very excited to do that. I am sitting inside in Ohio in the air conditioning, and Julie, you've taken another approach to our day together. Oh no, did I just lose Julie? That was like kind of a sad intro. Julie just texted me that it says that I'm off air. Well, what I'm going to do is give you guys this number for two reasons. One, it is to ask questions. So this is a live Q&A webinar. But the other thing I'm going to make you do is text me and let me know if you can see me or Julie. So here's the number. I think that Julie is just frozen, and hopefully she'll be joining us in a minute.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here!
Yeah. As soon as you went live, you went off air for me. So
I gave you such an epic introduction. I was like, Julie, and then you weren't there.
Maybe it's good that I missed it.
Right. I mean, it wasn't that exciting. I just said I'm sitting inside in the air conditioning in Akron, Ohio, and you've chosen another approach for our time together.
I have. Yeah, it is. It's summer, and it's going fast, so we got to enjoy it while it's here.
Yeah, so you are in Colorado Springs.
Yeah.
As usual. Yeah. And is it like beautiful and wonderful there?
It's going to be 90 today, so I'm in the shade, and it's not that hot yet. So I'm here with my little buddy, Zoe. She's gonna help me answer questions today.
Are you wearing a long sleeve shirt?
Yeah, I do have a long sleeve shirt on, but it's very cool. Crazy. It's very cool. So
I know, but you said it's 90 degrees and you're outside and you're in a long sleeve shirt.
My husband's been out of town for 2 weeks, and I have not turned the air conditioning on. It's been great.
I do know that you're always cold, and every time I'm in your house, I'm like, it's a little chilly here. I'm impressed that Julie does this.
It's my husband.
Oh, goodness. Well, Julie, I'm really excited to hang out with you. And I was just realizing that as I was making fun of you, I am also wearing long sleeves.
Look at that.
Mine's like a quarter sleeve.
So is mine.
Oh, that's a long sleeve.
No, it's quarter, see?
Your arms are just short.
That's true. That is very true.
It looks like long sleeve, even though it's a quarter sleeve. Okay, so anyway, I was introducing you, and then you were gone. So I feel like it kind of threw off my situation here. But I'm glad that we're both together. And friends, we're glad that you're here. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for those of you who registered for this webinar. We heard from a lot of you who registered and signed up, and we're so thankful. And then, as always, if you are a member of Authentic Intimacy, which is open to anyone and very exciting, you get to join these for free every month and watch all the old ones for free. And we know that there's a lot of our members who are joining us today and for this as well. So to newbies or to people who've been around for a long time, welcome. Our ministry is called Authentic Intimacy, and we are really passionate about God's truth around sexuality and really helping men and women make sense of their sexuality. So we do that through conferences, through books, Bible studies, different content like our awesome podcast, and monthly webinars. So Julie's the boss. I follow her around, and she teaches all kind of awesome things. That's my summary of our ministry.
I love the way you summarize it.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So today is a little bit different of a webinar because we are doing a lot of Q&A. That's really what most of the webinar is live Q&A. So we're going to give you this number. If you could write it down, or what would be even better is if you send a text right now. So send a text and be like, hey, glad to be here. Or I'm watching from Alaska. You could tell us where you're from. You could tell us just a hello. But essentially what we want to do today is use this phone number, and you can text any questions you have. So if you saw our promotional video for this or read on the webinar page, essentially our vision and our excitement for this is that whenever we do a full day conference, we do this live Q&A. So Julie teaches on God's truth around sexuality, on why it's a big deal. on what it looks like in our lives and our marriage. And then we open it up to Q&A, like ask any question and she'll answer it. So that's really what we are excited to do today, is focus more on just questions you have. So they can be anything. They can be any questions. And Julie, there's a lot of things in life that you're not that good at. However, you are very good at helping us walk through and apply God's truth to all different questions. And I just love how you do that.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm excited to do that today and asking God for wisdom, because I don't know what they're going to ask. So yeah,
I know. You have the craziest job.
I do. Yeah. So we thought we'd kick off our conversation today just to get some questions going. Some of you might have seen that a blog that we put up this week, and it was related to some news stories, and particularly two news stories. One of them was in Teen Vogue. It was a very explicit news article encouraging teenagers to experiment with anal sex. And then the other news story was something that happened in the Christian world last week with Eugene Peterson, who is the author of the paraphrase translation of the Bible called The Message. He had an interview about gay marriage and his perspective on that. And one day said one thing, and then the next day came back and retracted his statements. So the blog I wrote was about that, not particularly looking at those two issues in depth, but more using those two issues to really look at the fact that we need to be grounded in our understanding of sexuality, because those kind of questions and news events happen all the time. And it just kind of shows us how confused we are as a culture, and even how confused we are as a church.
Yeah, and Julie, I was just going to pull up that blog here because I really liked it as you were talking about it. And one of the quotes that you had in there was essentially saying that this is pointing to like a much deeper issue. Like it's not just about, like, don't have a conversation or just be worked up about this article in Teen Vogue about anal sex, or just this leader's comments around homosexuality, but this is like a bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the reason that I think that, Hannah, is, and some of you might know this, but I am in the midst of editing, finishing a book that is going to be coming out this time next year. It's called, the new title for it is called Rethinking Sexuality. But essentially it's on this whole concept of sexual discipleship, and why and how we get rooted and really grounded in biblical truth on sexuality. So the deeper issue is that we have a world that is really changing how we view sexual things and how we talk about sexual things. And then we have a Christian culture that doesn't know how to respond to that. So my passion and my call, really the call of my life, is to help us be grounded and rooted in a biblical understanding of sexuality, and then how that applies to questions like the news articles that came up last week.
Yeah, Julian, I love when you talk about that. And, you know, some of the texts that are coming in are saying that they're very new to our ministry, just found your podcast. Another one said, just heard of you recently from a friend, really excited to be on this webinar. So, you know, to you, as you've been so deep in this book and writing this idea of like rethinking sexuality, and this blog you wrote about how do we have like a biblical response to like anything that is thrown at us with sexuality. You use this like analogy, I guess. I don't think it's an analogy, whatever. You use a term to help understand the contrast of how we have been dealing with sexuality versus how you're essentially calling the church. And you kind of compare and contrast sexual education versus sexual discipleship. And I know that that's like a big theme that you're writing through this book, and is really, during this Q&A, one thing that you're trying to model is the difference in those. Could you just give us like a explanation on that difference?
Yeah. So if you have any exposure to how the church addresses sexuality, I'm going to paint with a broad brush here because there are exceptions, but traditionally either the church is really quiet on these issues and says, you know, hey, we really don't talk about those things in church and that's too personal. Or we have an educational approach and you can hear an airplane flying over my head right now. So that's the beauty of living right by the Air Force Academy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so Julie's right in Colorado Springs, and the Air Force Academy is like right down the road from her. So there's planes all over the place when you're in town with her.
Yeah, that is very true. You never know. Sometimes you get jets flying overhead. But the educational approach is really where, a church, for example, will have a purity retreat for their teenagers. And then they'll have like a marriage class for married couples, and they might talk a little bit about Song of Solomon, or then they'll have a group for people that are addicted to pornography. But it's kind of like presenting problems and issues and just giving you sort of a slice of how to address that one issue. And the problem when we have an educational approach is you might have the answer to one question, but you never really learned how to think through, why does sexuality matter in the first place? And if my situation is different from the person sitting next to me, how do I apply biblical truth to my situation? Because we never covered that. Another problem with the educational approach, or even the silence approach, I think a lot of us can identify with this. We tend to slap like very simplistic answers onto really complex questions. So for example, somebody might ask the question, do you think it's wrong to attend a gay marriage? And an educational approach is kind of just to say yes or no. Like, I believe it's always wrong, or I think it's right. And what happens then is we become judgmental, we become legalistic, we become simplistic about a very complicated issue. Like, who is the person's wedding? Is it your sister? Is it your daughter? What's the context? Do they know Jesus? Let's really dig into this. And so discipleship model is teaching you truths about sexuality from Scripture, and not only truths about sexuality, but truths about how God calls us to live. How does he call us to balance, for example, truth and showing love to other people, so that you feel equipped to engage in whatever conversations come up around sexuality. So how did I describe that okay?
Yeah, that's the perfect way to describe it. And Julie, when I've heard you talk about that, there's so many areas of my life where I know that I've done that with, where I have like a education like response. Like I'm like, I know that this is wrong in the Bible. I could probably point to a verse, but I don't really understand why. I just know that I know that it's supposed to be wrong. And when you talk about this, how we have like a quick answer, but can't really answer this bigger picture around sexuality, I like flash right back to my freshman year in college. I remember sitting in a dorm room with two of my friends. I'm sitting in my dorm room. These two friends are sitting on a couch, and we're all freshmen. We don't know each other. We've only known each other for a few months, and it comes out that one of my friend's brothers is gay. And she's like talking about it and saying like why this is where he is and this is okay and that's just how he was made. And I remember my other friend getting very upset about it. Like, no, like that's not how God made us. Like, gay marriage is not okay. Like, it is not okay to be homosexual. Like, that is a sin. And I remember my friend just responding like, why? And her being like, I don't, that's just what God says. And I remember like later that night hearing her on her phone with her dad, who was a pastor, being like, why is gay marriage wrong? Like, what verse can I show her? Like, I didn't know what to say. And I remember like walking down the hallway and hearing that conversation. And I just always remember that moment as you talk about this, because it's right. Like, as believers, we know what we're supposed to say about sexuality. Sometimes we know, but we like can't say why, or we like can't have a conversation about it because we haven't been discipled in sexuality, that we actually have like a fluent language to talk about this with.
Yeah. So that's a heart, and that's just one example, but you can use lots of examples. And when you mentioned, Hannah, the Q&A, we get asked so many different questions about sexuality, and a few of them are really cut and dry. We can point to a Bible passage and say, here's where God says this is right or wrong. But most questions have so much nuance and context to them that we really need discernment, and we need the ability not only to know what does the Bible say about sex, but apply principles of, who does God say we should be as Christ followers, and how do we apply those principles to the complicated questions that we're addressing in our lives.
Awesome. Well, Julie, with that, I'm really excited to get started with some Q&A. And I would say this whole conversation that we started this with about understanding sexuality in terms of being discipled in it and not just this like yes or no education approach. When someone says you're writing the book on something, it means like you're the expert in it. Like, oh, she could write the book on home decorating. Like you are literally writing the book on sexual discipleship, but this is still a newer concept for you, right? Like 10 years ago, would you have been able to do a Q&A like this around sexuality?
No, no, I'm still learning. And, you know, you always, I think, right out of the questions that you're trying to answer. And so, so I feel like God's equipped me to be a few steps ahead of the people that are asking the questions, but I am learning things that I didn't know 6 months ago, even as I write, as I teach, and as I study, and as I pray. So we're always still learning.
Yeah, that's definitely true. All right. Well, friends, your texts are coming in, and I'm really excited about that. Thank you so much for texting us. We have people from all over. Someone from Denmark is watching, which
Awesome.
is so fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have Illinois, Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana, Minnesota, Pennsylvania. Kentucky. So thank you guys so much for texting in. So we will go ahead and jump to those questions. It's not too late. Write this down, text it in. You can send any questions. If we answer your question and then you have a follow-up or you have another one, keep them coming, friends. We have plenty of time to go through these. Awesome. Well, Julie, let's get started. It's always so hard to know where to start because I really love questions. I love these questions that come in. I think I love them because when I do the live Q&A and I get to see the faces of the men and women asking the questions, and then I hear from them afterwards where it's like, I've been wondering this, or like, you answering this question has really affected me or my marriage. And it's just fun. Even though we can't see the faces of these sweet friends, they're hanging out with us on the computer screen. So we wish you could see you guys, but thanks for sending the questions in. Okay. Julie, I recently heard you use the word covenant when you were talking about marriage. Where in the Bible does God describe marriage as a covenant? Why is this word such a big deal?
Yeah, well, really good question. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that there are some things in the Bible that are chapter and verse really clear. And there's other things in the Bible that we know truths that are really more based on kind of principles, overarching principles. And covenant, there's not a verse in the Bible that specifically says when you get married, you enter into a covenant that uses those words. But first of all, the overarching principle of the Bible, if there's one message throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's this concept of covenant, that God has this covenant relationship first with the people of Israel, that they're his chosen people, that he promises to protect them and to be faithful to them and to be their God, that they're set apart. And then we see in the New Testament that God has this covenant relationship now with those who trust in Jesus Christ for salvation, that it's a covenant eternal relationship. And throughout the scripture, we see that marriage was supposed to be kind of a mini earthly version of that covenant love. And in Ephesians chapter 5, 31 and 32, the Apostle Paul alludes to this and says that the love that a husband has for a wife is a mystery in that it points to the love that Christ has for his church. And then there's the same covenantal language that's used for marriage as is used for God's relationship with his people. So, for example, God would say to us, I will never leave you or forsake you. And then the scripture would talk about the covenant of marriage, that it's for life. That it's to become one flesh, and that whatever God has brought together, no one can tear apart, so that it's permanent. And then we also see the language throughout Scripture that a woman plays a different role in that covenant than a man does, because the woman is representing Christ, or the church, and the man is representing Christ's sacrificial love. So this is such an important concept because it's not just in one verse. It actually is all throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. So for example, another example of this is, I mentioned that God had a covenant relationship with the people of Israel. Well, the people of Israel started worshiping other gods. And in some of the prophetic books like Jeremiah and Hosea and Ezekiel, God says to his covenant people, you have broken covenant with me. You are a prostitute. You have cheated on your husband. You are an adulterer. And so God uses the language for sexual unfaithfulness in marriage to describe what the people had done in breaking their covenant with him. So that's an in-depth answer, but it's really an in-depth question. And it's a central concept to understanding how we approach sexuality when we really grasp that it's linked to this idea of covenant.
We were just talking before we started that I officially celebrated my 4-year anniversary at Authentic Intimacy this week. And in that time, I've heard you talk and teach around sexuality, obviously many times. And really, it's really been more recent that you've been talking so much about the importance of how this connects with covenant. I mean, I even think, we have Passion Pursuit, which is a 10-week Bible study for wives, all about sex and marriage. And while that concept is alluded to, I feel like it's not like specifically taught as much. Just correct? Like with this thing with the word covenant.
Yeah.
And I love that. Like, I love watching the further you dive into this, there's so much to go into with sexuality.
Yeah, there is. And we have a podcast episode actually that you and I recorded, Hannah. I think it aired maybe about a month
I actually
ago.
pulled it up while you were
You
talking
did?
because
Great.
It's really good. Okay, so guys, if you go to javawithjulie.com, Julie is a little fancy. She doesn't have an E on her name, so it's Juli, javawithjulie.com, or you could just find it on our website, authenticintimacy.com. It is episode number 160, so 160. It's called Why God Created You to Be Sexual. And essentially in this interview, it's kind of an interview. In this podcast, I get to interview Julie. There's no guest. It's just Julie and I. And I ask her a lot of questions around this. And it is such a good episode. So to our friend who asked that question, hopefully that gives you a little taste of why that word is such a big deal. And we'd also love for you to listen to that Java with Julie.
Yeah.
That is such a good one. Man, so many questions coming in. All right, Julie, I feel like I often get bored or even freaked out before we start anything around sex with my husband. How would I begin to increase my desire for intimacy in my marriage?
Yeah. Well, bored and freaked out are kind of two different issues. So,
hey, and we can hit them both. Yeah,
we could.
That happens.
Yeah. So boredom. One thing that's great about marriage and sexuality is that it's constant, and there's research that shows that just even constant, what you might call vanilla sex is actually really good for a relationship and marriage. Just even the endorphins that your body emits and dopamine and oxytocin that bonds you, it's really good for your marriage. But as your question notes, we also need some excitement. And particularly for women, it can be very difficult to get into that mental space when you've just gotten done doing 10 loads of laundry and there's a kid screaming and you're like, this is just boring. Let's just get it over with. I'm not too excited about this. So if you haven't already done it, I'm going to really recommend the Bible study Passion Pursuit because we go into great detail in this. But a lot of it is training your mind of how to kind of leave mommy space or just, task-oriented woman space and get into, all right, this is a gift that God has given me and my husband. And emotionally and mentally and physically, I need to begin getting prepared to enjoy this. And most women, not all women, but most women have a very difficult time when sex is just kind of like in marriage flung on them. Like you've gone through a long day and then all of a sudden your husband's like, hey, now would be a good time. And you can't get in the mood. So one of the things that can be most helpful is to either have a code word that kind of signifies to you, hey, this is something we're going to be doing later today or tonight or tomorrow, whenever, and I can emotionally and mentally get excited about it and ready for it. Another thing that some couples do to help with that is they schedule sex, which sounds boring, but it actually allows you to, for example, light some candles and think about, what can we do that's romantic or new or different and enjoy? What can I do to keep the kids busy? So that kind of thing can really, really help. And again, we give some teaching even out of the Song of Solomon of how the bride in the Song of Solomon did that, kind of as an inspiration for how we can do that. So that tackles the boredom. I think the freaked out piece of it, I would want to ask more questions about that. Like, what do you mean by that? Is it a fear issue? Is it an issue where you feel like, hey, if I really got into this, I would feel like I was doing something wrong? And a lot of, I think, Christian women wrestle with that, particularly if you've grown up in a culture that's constantly emphasizing purity. It's like, I just don't know if I'm okay with losing control and having fun. And again, that's an issue that we address a lot in Passion Pursuit, but that's also just uncovering a lie. A lot of us believe the lie that a godly woman isn't supposed to enjoy this too much, that there's something wrong with having fun in the bedroom. So I'd want to ask some questions about what that freaked out means.
Yeah, and Julie, I'm glad you brought that up, because we hear from women all the time who love the Lord and were raised in the church, and their like whole heart and desire is to just like love him and worship him. But for them, like, purity has meant a complete lack of anything sexual desire. Like, essentially, like, this sexual piece of me, like, does not exist. Like, that's how purity has been kind of like displayed or thought of in their life. So then once they happen to marriage, they're like, how am I just supposed to like turn this on? Like, and you're right. A lot of times we'll hear the word freaked out when we hear that from women, because they're just essentially saying, for so much of my life, and even how sex is talked about in the church, this is just not something that I'm supposed to be into.
Yeah, absolutely. And for that reason, we are a little hesitant at Authentic Intimacy to even use the word purity, because I think it pushes a lot of buttons for women.
We just don't love the word purity.
We like the concept, but it's kind of, I think, a barrier for a lot of Christian women.
I feel like you just need to talk about that for 1 minute.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, you just kind of described it, Hannah, but I think if you grew up in the church, whether the Protestant church or the Catholic church, like this emphasis of purity, not always, but a lot of times it translated into you're not allowed to be a sexual person. And even your desires are wrong, your thoughts are wrong, like just push them all down, pretend they don't exist. And my neighbors just came out to play basketball, so I'm going to go in the house so you don't have that distraction. But yeah, but I know
I don't hear it yet.
You don't hear it? Okay, if you hear it, let me know, because sometimes it gets heated. Yeah, all kinds of fun here in Colorado Springs. So yeah, so did I describe that okay by what I mean by that?
Yeah, and again, obviously the heart behind individuals teaching to walk around purity is a similar heart to what we have, is of the importance of this just being something that you walk out in marriage. But yeah, for so many people, it's translated to, so that means I am not sexual. And in order to be godly, I have absolutely no sexual thoughts or desires.
Yeah, absolutely. So now my neighbors are getting loud, so I'm going to go inside while you ask the next question.
Okay. This is like a traveling road show over here. Yeah, so friends, thanks for keep texting these in. It's fun to see all these come in. We have one from one of our single friends here, Julie, that I liked it. I liked her question, and essentially she is looking for your elevator speech. So what that means is, like, if you had, 30 seconds or a minute to describe what you do or to give an answer, that's like your elevator spiel. So this is what she wants an elevator spiel for. So a quick answer, which you can also give a longer answer, but She said, if you're a single girl, what is your go-to short answer when someone asks, why don't you want to have sex before marriage?
Wow.
Do you have a light that you can turn on? Your face is dark.
I know. Here we go. Come on, Zoe. So my elevator speech on that one. Let's see. My elevator speech, is that better? Can you see me?
Yep.
Okay. My elevator speech on that one might be, well, I do want to have sex before I get married, but there's a lot of things I want to do that that conflict with what I believe. And I believe that marriage is a covenant between a man and a woman, and that God designed sex to be the celebration of that covenant. So while I do want to have sex, I really believe that God's design is what's best for me, and that's what I'm holding out for.
Hey, that's a good elevator speech.
Yeah.
So, Julie, you have a book coming out next month.
I do.
Exciting. And I feel like we haven't talked about it a ton at Authentic Intimacy. I think mainly because this book comes out next month and you're already working on the next book. So it's just been kind of a fun season of craziness. But to our friend who texted this in, and I'm seeing a lot of other questions from our single friends, we have a new book coming out, and it is called Sex and the Single Girl. Yeah. And essentially, Julie created this as a 6-week study to help our single friends walk through sexuality from their life as a single girl. Yeah, so Julie, if I liked your short answer, but anything else you would add to that as you're helping people, for people who are texting in, and that question of how else can I explain, or why, what's the big deal about not sleeping with someone before I'm married?
Yeah, absolutely. And also to mention that our webinar next month is going to be on sex and the single girl.
That's right. Good marketing.
Yeah.
Julie.
So we'll be going into depth about that study and that book and answering some of these questions as well. But again, I'm going to refer back to a conversation that we had a few minutes ago about covenant. So you've got to make a decision about why you think we're sexual people. Why do you think, if you believe there's a God that created us, why do you think he made us as sexual people? And usually when I ask people that, I kind of get blank stares. You know, they might say, so we could have babies. And then I'll say, well, yeah, that's true. But God could have designed us to have babies, like, you know, drink this formula and you have a baby, or do a secret handshake and you have a baby. So why did God create this thing called sex, where there's a man and a woman, and it's very intimate, and it's very personal, and it's very vulnerable, and it's passionate, and you lose control? Why did he make it that way? And the way that I explain this from scripture is that God created us as sexual people so that we would understand the passion of covenant love, so that we would understand, you know, how vulnerable covenant love is, and we'd have a way of, with our bodies, celebrating that. And I would also tell you that as a clinical psychologist, the research that I look at, and you won't hear this very often, but the research out there on the impact of taking sex outside of covenant love is always negative. Like, you can't find a research study that shows you that you'll be a healthier person if you have sex with lots of people outside of marriage. As a matter of fact, the research shows the opposite. Particularly for women, the more sexual partners you have, the poorer over your lifetime your emotional health. You deal with things like depression and regret and guilt. You know, then there's physical things like sexually transmitted diseases and, you know, pregnancies that you weren't expecting. And so the answer that I would give is God designed sex to be within a certain covenant relationship. And it's a really good thing for our bodies and our minds and our souls when we use it within that covenant relationship. But anytime we take it out of that covenant relationship, it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that when we sin sexually, we actually sin against our bodies. And the psychological and medical research actually bears that out. So that's my long answer.
I like the long answer and the short answer. And the really long answer will come next month. Will come next month during that webinar, which will be really great to see that too. So thanks, Julie.
Yeah.
All right, here is a text that came in. Hello from Arkansas. We have people from all over.
Hey.
Every time that my husband and I have sex, I feel like I disassociate and feel less connected to him than we were before. This has happened for our entire marriage, which has been 15 years. I recently found out my husband's also been struggling with pornography during that time. Is there any hope for us? What does it mean that sex seems to disconnect us instead of connect us?
Yeah, really good question. And thanks for being so vulnerable with that. So there are a couple reasons why we dissociate during sex. One of them is, as you mentioned, like pornography. Pornography trains your sexual response to be connected with images in your mind. And so that image in your mind actually takes you out of the present. And so while your body might be engaging with somebody, your mind is actually engaging with an image of somebody that either doesn't exist or isn't obviously in your bedroom. So that's a form of dissociation or disconnecting. But another reason that we disassociate if sex represents something painful for us. So a lot of times when women struggle with dissociation during sex, they have some kind of sexual trauma in their past where their body is actually trained as a protective mechanism that you might be touching me, but you're not going to get to my heart and my soul. You're not going to get to who I am as a person. And so, if I were talking to you personally out there in Arkansas, I would ask you that question. Like, what does sex represent for you? Does it represent some sort of trauma? Does it represent not feeling safe? Is it because your husband's been using pornography that you don't feel like you're able to be vulnerable with him? And so, yes, there is hope for you. And the hope comes in addressing those barriers, and really taking them seriously. Obviously, the barrier of pornography, taking that seriously and working through that issue, but also working through whatever trauma or past event makes you feel like sexuality is in a safe place.
Yeah, and to this friend, we've heard from women before who sexual abuse to them is something that they can't quite remember or isn't quite clear, and will sometimes have this question like, did something happen to me? Like, I have this vague sense, but I'm experiencing these things. Julie, could you speak to that a little bit? Just if our friend from Arkansas is thinking like, oh, I don't know if I have, or I'm not sure what my past has looked like with some of that.
Yeah. So the whole idea of dissociation is the body and the mind's protective tendency to keep us away from painful things. And that includes memories. So the reason that sexual abuse or other traumas at times are hard to remember is because, particularly if you were abused as a child, a protective mechanism of your mind is to just push that memory away, because a child can't process that. It's too much for them. Your body can't process it. And so what we often see happen is, particularly women in their 30s or 40s, when you get married, you're sexually active, you start raising your children, that there can be a vague sense of either, I feel like something happened to me, like sex has always just felt dirty, or a physical sensation that gets triggered, or pieces of memories that I know something happened with this person. Like, I remember the place, I remember the feeling, but that's all I remember. And so that essentially is like your body and your mind's way of saying, it's now time to deal with this trauma. And when you were 6, it was too much. Maybe when you were 15, it was too much. But now it's time to just really look into what happened and why sexuality has become something that represents pain and fear, and to address it. And like I said, it's really common for that pattern to happen to women in their 30s and 40s, where it's almost like God is saying, now it's time to seek healing.
And yeah, Julie, I love even, her question of saying, is there hope? Because I know that is a question that for a lot of these sweet friends who are texting us in, that's a part of their question that they're asking, because it feels lonely. It feels hopeless. It feels like, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I broken? Or why is this so difficult? And one of my favorite go-to things for that, Julie, is one of our books at Authentic Intimacy called Surprised by the Healer. And for this friend from Arkansas, and for any others, if you have something that you've been texting in and asking and feeling like this is hard, is there hope? That book screams hope. So Surprised by the Healer is a book that tells 9 stories of women who had sexual or relational brokenness, and their story of God healing them. And it's not all these perfect, happy Disney endings, but it's like the real work of watching the Lord heal through things like abuse, through affairs, after divorce, pornography. And it is just a book that is real, because it walks you through these friends of ours, these 9 women who we got to interact with and hear their stories. So Yeah, I'd love for you to read that if you want a dose of hope. That's a great place to start.
Yeah.
So, all right, Julie, I like this question. I feel like we are asked something similar to this in a lot of different ways, but I like how this friend texted it. By the way, she said she's a longtime fan of our ministry, and she went through Passion Pursuit with a friend a few years ago, which is awesome. So, all right, she said, I feel like everything has to be just right emotionally for me to be interested in sex. My husband can easily just set aside the cares of his day if there's any chance to have sex with me. However, I don't feel the same way. How can I learn to move towards intimacy when I'm angry at something or distracted by the worries of my week?
Really good question. And that's a pretty common difference between men and women, because women traditionally need to feel safe. They need to feel connected. And then sex is sort of the expression of that connectedness and that safety. Whereas men actually view it as sex is what helps me feel safe and what helps me feel connected. So if there's stress in a marriage relationship, sometimes the man will want to solve that stress by saying, if we can connect physically, then it's going to help me connect with you emotionally. Whereas we as women see it the other way around. So one of the ways to get past that, and a good piece of it is that you already acknowledge that that's a hang up for you, but is to actually look at it from the guy's perspective, because what the guys are saying actually has some merit. So a man will say, I only feel connected with you or close to you when we're physically intimate, like when we have sex together. And women view that as, I think you're just kind of playing me, that sort of thing. And this woman has gone through Passion Pursuit, so she's learned this, that actually what men are saying is validated by science, that for men, one of the main times in their lives where they get a dose of oxytocin. And oxytocin is the hormone in your body that makes you feel close to someone, helps you overlook shortcomings, just helps you feel good around a person. A man will get a very strong dose of oxytocin after sexual intimacy. So when I really understood this, what it did for me and my thinking as a woman was to say, yeah, I know my husband and I have these things that we need to talk through. And we're going to talk through them. We're working on them. But sexual intimacy is actually a way that God has given me to soften my husband's heart. And even chemically, the research shows that a man for 24 to 48 hours after sex feels more connected to his wife. He sees her as more beautiful. He actually is more likely to walk away from a beautiful stranger when he has a dose of oxytocin. This is all research. And so God has given me that gift with my husband to really, kind of inoculate Mike with oxytocin before we start handling some of these difficult issues, before we have the conversations about the stresses we're dealing with and the conflicts that we're having trouble resolving. So if you can see it that way, which again feels very backwards for women, but the science actually shows that this is true, that if we can connect physically first, it actually softens the heart of a husband to address some of those emotional issues that are more difficult to talk through.
Yeah, Julie, I love how you answer that and talk through that, where it was literally like the switch in your mindset when you realize that this is like a great tool.
Yeah.
Like, this is a way for us to become closer. And yeah, I'm sure for this friend and for many of us, it's still hard to get your mind there, but it's just like anything, like working at that and training that and seeing the advantage of that.
I mean, and sexual intimacy for a lot of husbands is like a huge motivator. So I don't mean this to sound like it's manipulative, but if I were to say to my husband, I feel like we're disconnected, I'd really like to work on intimacy together and sexuality in our relationship, he's going to be like, all right, that sounds great. Let's do that. That I want to be more connected too. But if I approach my husband and say, I think that there are these conflicts with the kids or with money that we need to talk through, he's going to be like, oh, I really don't want to do that. And so some of it is using the natural motivation that God has given in marriage, particularly for a man, to say, I love connecting with my wife. And part of connecting with my wife is not just sharing physically, but in the midst of that and around that, also saying that there are some barriers that keep me from feeling close to you, that keep me from feeling safe with you, and we need to address those as well.
That's a good way to say that, Julie. All right, well, we still got a lot of text coming in. Here's one kind of going back to some of that question, Julie, around describing marriage as a covenant, and that promise and covenant between us and God and us and our spouse. And they asked, how does a believer reconcile breaking their covenant with God if they're divorced?
Yeah, really good question. So you have to remember that God has created marriage as a metaphor for this covenant love that he has with his people. And a metaphor means that it can teach us a lot about it. There's a lot of overlap, but it also means that it's not exactly the same, that there's principles we can apply, but there's also things that aren't 100% the same. We know in the Bible that God says he hates divorce. That divorce wasn't his design. His design was for a man and woman to commit for life and to be faithful to each other. But we also see that God makes provision for divorce, and that there are situations, a couple that are mentioned in Scripture very clearly. If you're married to an unbeliever who wants to leave, it says let him go. Let him break that covenant. Let him go. There's another situation in Scripture that talks about God allowing divorce for continual sexual infidelity. If somebody continues to break their sexual faithfulness to you, that's a reason. It's severe enough of a reason for divorce. And it also says in Malachi that God hates divorce, and he also hates a man that covers himself with violence. So if you're in a marriage relationship where, yes, you've made the promise and you have this covenant, but things are so broken relationally, there's no fidelity, there's no love, then that's a tragedy. And it's important to understand that God makes provision for divorce in those situations. It's never a good thing, but sometimes it can be a necessary thing because we're broken people and we're sinful people. So the one thing that I would encourage you to do if you've gone through a divorce is to realize, and firsthand, that divorce causes a tidal wave of pain in your life, in your kids' life, in extended family and friends. And that's just a reminder that this was never what God had intended from the first place, that any broken covenant is going to bring pain, whether it's our fault or someone else's choice, because it wasn't God's design. But God has also sent his son to say, I'm redeeming everything that's broken. I'm redeeming divorce. I'm redeeming broken relationships. I'm redeeming infidelity. And God forgives our sins. And he says, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to write a new story with your life.
I love that, Julie. And just as another point on that, that's a story that is touched on with Surprised by the Healer of even going through a divorce and what that looks like. So could be another good follow-up resource to go through with that. One of my really sweet friends who just went through a divorce was just telling me, about like a divorce care class she went through at her church and how huge that was for her also. So I think especially for her and for many of my friends who have gone through a divorce, it feels so lonely and you're kind of almost afraid to process it out loud. And for her church, it went through it and really helped her spiritually have these conversations with the Lord around her divorce. And it was really, really healing for her. So I would love for you to pray about looking into that for your church. So also. More questions coming in. Julie, we have this one here, which is a tough one, and I would just love some of your wisdom and encouragement for it. A little over a year ago, she walked in on her husband masturbating to a picture of someone in her family that she's close with. Confessed to having an infatuation with her years ago before they were Christians, and said it was just a slip up that she happened to catch him on. Counseling and have been working. She said they've become closer and he's really been healing, but she still has this feeling of hurt and betrayal. She said, there's no area of my life that this hasn't affected. How can I continue in healing when I feel so hurt?
Well, really good question. First of all, I'm sorry that you've walked through that. That's just incredibly painful. But I'm also glad that you and your husband have taken steps of getting counseling and healing. And, that can be a big part of healing, is not just, a confession, but also understanding what are some of the things that led your husband down this path, because that makes you more confident that you're addressing the underlying issue. But I think even in your question, it shows how sacred covenant is. It shows how sacred sexuality is. You can have a husband who burns dinner and you get over it. You can have a husband who loses his temper once and yells and you get over it. But when there's a sexual infidelity, it just wounds us at such a deep level because you've got broken covenant and broken faithfulness. And so it's really natural for that to be incredibly difficult to get through and get over. It's not something that you just sort of forgive and forget. So a big piece of that, and this is something that Linda Dillow shares just a great story about in the Bible study Passion Pursuit, is one of the recommendations that we make when you're going through healing, when you're going through counseling, when you really feel like your husband is truly remorseful and confessed and you're working through, okay, let's build a new marriage, let's build a new covenant of faithfulness, is actually doing something very tangible to put a stake in the ground and to say, this has been dealt with. It still hurts at times. I still struggle with it, but it has been dealt with between us. It has been dealt with between us and the Lord. It has been forgiven, and it's time to build something new. And so Linda shares, for example, the story of one couple that went through an anointing ceremony where the wife actually anointed the different parts of her husband's body and just said, I forgive you for thinking thoughts of her, and I forgive you for looking at her, and just went down his whole body and just said, I'm choosing to forgive you. And then they just prayed and said, this is in the past. And there does come a time in healing and in counseling where you need to do something like that. And you need to say, doesn't mean it still won't hurt, but I'm choosing to say that's been dealt with, and we're not going to live there anymore.
Yeah, and to our friend who texted that in, thanks so much just for your honesty, and I'm so sorry just for that pain. When Julie was talking through that forgiveness time, that almost forgiveness ceremony, that was the first thing I thought of when I read your question, because we've heard from so many women who have a story along that lines and have these sweet stories of forgiveness that are not easy and are not quick, but they're beautiful. And that what she described is in Passion Pursuit. So Passion Pursuit is our 10-week Bible study. It has a workbook and a DVD. So you watch the DVD each week of Julie and Linda teaching, and then you have 5 days of homework in the workbook. And there's a whole chapter around forgiveness that is really, really powerful. And it's specifically talking about within sexuality and within sex in your marriage. So
yeah, and I would encourage you, it's chapter 8, week 8. So even if you're not at the place now where you want to go through the whole course and the whole book, even if you got the video for session 8 on Right Now Media, or you can get through our website and just watch that teaching, maybe even watch it as a couple. I think it could be really a powerful piece of your healing.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Julie. That would be a great session to go through. All right, we have a text here from a friend in Ohio. She said, I have had a bondage fetish ever since I was about 8 years old, and I have no idea where it came from. In order to have an orgasm or really any sexual pleasure, I have to completely disassociate and think about bondage. How can I fix this problem without causing bigger problems in my marriage? If I just stop enjoying sex in the name of being present, I know it will hurt my husband's feelings, so I've never known what to do.
Yeah, really good question. And again, thanks for being so honest with that. I would say 2 things. First of all, I think at some level it's important to get to the root of what it is about bondage that is tied to sexuality for you. So, is it usually bondage has to do with feeling out of control, with feeling subdued or submissive, and or helpless, or if you're the one that's putting the other person in bondage, it's about feeling dominant and feeling overpowering. Not always, but sometimes people that have that kind of fetish have trauma in their past related to that, a sexual experience related to feeling out of control or feeling helpless. or then feeling dominating, like I have to dominate someone else or imagine that. So I think it's important for you just to ask the Lord, if there's anything in my past that's kind of feeding into this, would you just show that to me so I can begin working through that? And then the second thing I would say is, you can't replace sexual excitement with one thing by just trying not to think about that one thing. And that's a lot of times where we struggle is, you're in the moment, you're saying, don't go there, don't think of that thought. Well, what should you think? And, a lot of it is training your mind of how to think about sexually exciting things with your spouse in a way that's honoring. So what are you replacing that thought with? How are you training your mind and your body to respond to something that's healthy? And again, the Song of Solomon can be kind of an encouragement of that. And we unpack that a lot in Passion Pursuit. There are other resources that can be helpful for that. Linda Dillow and her husband wrote a book called Intimacy Ignited that's helping couples go through the Song of Solomon together and discover, ways that we can focus on sensation and the moment and focus on things we'd love to do together. So you need to begin replacing the bad thought with a positive thought.
Yeah, I love that, Julie. And I know when I've heard you teach through that before, that makes so much sense about, again, not just removing this, but what are you putting into that and into like focusing on within sex and within intimacy. So I know that we say it a lot, but Passion Pursuit, friends, I'm telling you, it's a game changer. And that Bible study will really walk you through some of those pieces. So, well, we do not have time to get through all these. I think we have time for at least one more question. So thanks to all of our friends for texting them in. Just as a reminder, we have all of these answers and more hidden all throughout our website. We have our weekly podcast called Job with Julie. We have our blog that we're posting on. We have books, like we have one that's actually right in line with this. It's called 25 Questions You're Afraid to Ask About Love, Sex, and Intimacy. And it's the 25 questions we get asked most often with Julie's biblical quick answers. So there's so much more to dive into. We're so glad that you guys joined us for this today. Julie, let's go for this question from one of our friends who texted in and said that she's newer to authentic intimacy. She said they've been married for 12 years, and she asked about any books to spice up your sex life after 12 years of marriage. So I think you've heard us talk about Passion Pursuit a few times. We'd really recommend that. She said, honestly, one of the tougher parts is for the 12 years my husband has been constantly insecure, specifically even about the size of his package. He feels as though he's not man enough for us to have a lot of sexual pleasure. We've only ever been with each other. I've tried reassuring him, but nothing seems to work. He always is bringing it up that he's not good enough.
Yeah, good question. One thing I would do is just, really challenge him to identify that as a lie. Like that's something the enemy's telling you. He's trying to take away our joy. And I don't believe it, and I'm going to encourage you not to believe it. But I think the other thing you got to realize is that only a woman can make a man really feel desirable and sexy. And so I would encourage you to kind of take that as your personal goal, not to talk your husband into feeling like he's enough, but to pursue him in such a way that he's beginning to believe that he's enough. And you can maybe use your imagination and how to do that. But, the thing that is so seductive about pornography is that pornography is always available, and it's the way it's shot and the way it's positioned. It's to say, I want you. And men love to hear that. Men love to know that I want you and I'm here for you. And I think sometimes as wives, we don't understand the power of that's actually a very healthy power that God has given us to communicate with our eyes, with our words, with our body, that I want to be with you and I love being with you and you satisfy me so much and I want to have fun with you. And for the next 15 or 20 years, let's just think about all the fun we can have together. And a lot of times that sort of pursuit of your husband and pursuit of pleasure with him is going to be the thing that brings healing in that insecurity.
Julie, I love one of the teachings that you talk about a lot is the power that we have as wives. And just as you're saying that, I'm thinking of that exact thing, you know, of when you're talking about this question about an insecurity, you know, in your husband, of you saying, I don't know if we quite realize like how much power we have as wives and as women on our husbands. And I just thought of that. That's such a great example as you shared that. Well, Julie, we've already come to the end.
Yeah, we tackled a lot of questions, so I hope we got to most of yours.
Yeah, and thank you guys so much for texting in. I love seeing your fun little texts come in, and just knowing that for each of you who are saying just these sweet things about, you know, really wanting to pursue this in your life as you're a single woman, or really wanting to build this intimacy in your marriage. We're just so overwhelmed that the Lord's brought you to our ministry, and we know that God has so much to say and so much truth when it comes to sexuality, even though as the church as a whole, we haven't always shown that. So thank you guys for being a part just of what we're doing and a part of our little community. So again, you can look for any of those questions on our website, on some of our follow-up things. Java with Julie is a great place to just listen to a lot of these conversations that we have. After this webinar, you'll get an email and it has the same link. So this video, as soon as it ends, will magically turn into a YouTube video. So you can watch it again, share it with someone if it's something that they need to hear. And we're so glad that you guys joined us. Next month, we're going to be on here talking about singleness. We're going to talk about sex and the single girl. If you are single, are you still sexual? Spoiler, the answer is yes. And we're going to talk all about that next month. So thank you guys for joining us. Julie, thanks so much for hanging out. We always love getting wisdom from you.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a joy. I look forward to next month.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.